Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Cloud-Driven Data Insights in Government, sponsored by Microsoft on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. I'm your host, Jason Miller. Our guests today are Don Adcock, the Acting Chief Information Officer for the Energy Department, Greg Garcia, the Executive Director for the Army Information Technology Agency, Bajinder Pal, the Chief Information Officer for the Federal Trade Commission, and Derek Charlesbaugh, a Senior Solutions Specialist for Microsoft Federal. Now, gentlemen, before break, we're talking about security and specifically identity management, access control. And I want to turn back to Greg a little bit because, Greg, at DoD, you guys probably have among the strictest requirements around access control, identity management, and at the same time, you're probably further ahead than most agencies are battling things like, the insider threat. So when it comes to cloud and data analytics, where does that identity management piece fall in for you guys?
Yeah, I think one quick point to make before that discussion is really we talked about that hybrid approach and how do you get that, and that's really when you have a diverse customer base, because there isn't one single provider in the DoD or even in the Army. You have to build trust in what you do in the cloud and what you do with big data analytics. So one of the things we talked about is how do you do on-premise, off-premise, and then the migration. So just for ITA within the Pentagon, we've stood up a multi-tenant for unclassed and classified, basically a cloud presence within our installation processing node within the Pentagon to give that distinctive edge in the ability to have multi-tenants on a single infrastructure on-premise for both classified and unclassified information. We're also trying to corral all those public websites that are really on a demilitarized zoned area, so we can get them in a demilitarized zone area and then push them to the commercial cloud for that publicly available data. There's dozens and dozens of people that own all these particular applications or services, and that's one of the challenges. How do you corral a confederation or federation or a dissimilar group that has similar needs? And that's one of the things that DepSecDef is trying to do, is how do you coalesce a willingness to embark on these technologies with proven success. And that gets back to the security question and identity. One of the unique challenges we have is for the Army is the disconnected mode and the mobile mode. So I may not be connected to the network, but how do I save, store, and process information? And then when I do connect to that network, either through desktops, mobile devices, phone devices, how do I push that information on there? One of the things we talked about is the CAC or the new security card, but what happens when I'm using a secure phone or just a commercial phone that doesn't have a CAC reader or a card reader? You'll have to think about soft certs. How do you manage that security environment, not only with tokens, but with also soft tokens, and how do they merge together, and how do you have access? It gets back to that identity management and the levels of access you get to big data. Not everybody gets to see the entire picture. You've got to segregate that by classification, by need to know, and by processing area. But you do have to be able to look across domains and within domains to make those right decisions.
Is there a step you guys are taking by bringing the nodes down to the classified, unclassified levels? Are there technologies that you can talk to, obviously, that doesn't get into the sensitivities that are enabling that access control identity management piece beyond what we know about, that we know that to log onto your computer network, you need your CAC card?
Right. Really, that's as we all talked about, that converged architecture that's emerging, both compute and storage in single appliances or devices that really are multi-tenant designed. So I can put the Army, I can put the Marine Corps, I can put Joint Staff, I can put a fourth agency, I can put a coalition, all in the same infrastructure and have a detailed assessment of how to grant access. Really, that's the key to, again, leverage infrastructure as a service, desktop as a service, platform as a service, and make that holistic in the providing capability to the warfighter, again, for warfighting activities, for business activities, and for intelligence activities, and then merging those three domains into a viable, robust ability to make decisions.
Bajinder?
So I'll use a really bad analogy. Forgive me for that. But I think the convergence of security in the cloud is very similar to the capability maturity model in application development. Quite frankly, I mean, we've gone from dual-factor authentication on thin client application to obviously HSPD-12 for network, logical, and physical access. I think the exciting work that's going on now is with GSA, the Office of Citizen Services and Innovative Technology. They're working in joint collaboration with OMB and other agencies, U.S. Postal Services, on the F6 program, the identity in the cloud. I think, quite frankly, I mean, if that becomes a practical solution, the impact of that across the federal space, and especially how it touches the citizen services and the delivery of the mission, and the ease with which it can be managed. I think that's an exciting development that I think we need to be keeping our eyes on. Quite frankly, I mean, at the FTC, we were looking really closely at that, the development on that. So good stuff happening.
And I know the pilot for the F6 program is supposed to launch very soon, and I think there's also maybe a name change coming that we can talk about. Let's jump forward to a second, because I know we could spend a lot of time on security, but there's other considerations when we're talking about convergence of cloud and big data, and one of them is cost. The other one is the workforce issue. Both have their own complexities. The workforce issues we talked just briefly about earlier is moving from what Don said, people want to hug their servers, to having the right person who's managing that database, managing that server relationship with the private sector or internally, and then it's also the person understanding the data. So we'll go back to Don, since you brought up the hug the server. Are you finding that your workforce needs to shift as well?
Absolutely. One of the things that again I see in this transition to a knowledge-based society, if you will. First and foremost, to sort of tackle what you're asking me head on. Last year, I created a new data officer, a chief data officer for the department. It's going to be a senior level position, and we're currently in the recruitment process for that, because I take all of the multiple facets of things that we're trying to deal with right now, pretty seriously, and it rests on my shoulders to help provide solutions for the Department of Energy to move forward. And one of those is, what do we do about cultivating and bringing on board that new talent of data that we need in multiple disciplines, but in this particular case, data. So, what we're finding, and I think what we'll continue to see is, I don't necessarily need to have experts in data centers anymore, and people who understand how data centers operate and, what HVAC systems and things like that. The need to understand those things are still going to be there. But what the workforce I need to start recruiting are those folks that can take, that have that steeped knowledge, right, but are able to then translate that into, how do I review contracts? How do I service level agreements? How do I review requirements? And are the things that we're putting into all of those different documents, be it either if we're going to provide a government-based solution or an industry-based solution, is it right? Does it make sense? And then more importantly, once it's established, have we put in the right things to make sure that we run, maintain, operate, and continue to refresh it correctly? So I'm looking for, a joke, and I not to offend, but you tend to think of maybe a data center person as being somewhat, introverted, doesn't have to interact with many people. You can put them in the data center and it's okay. We now need that person who has, customer skills, analytical skills, and able to sort of be that advisor broker, if you will, between what it is we're trying to accomplish and then the solution that's going to be provided.
All right, I want to do a quick mini lightning round for everybody, okay? So here's the question. Chief Data Officer, does your company or agency have one?
No.
No. Do you have any plans?
I think it's more than data, right? So it's really about information and business needs. Data is just an element in the decision-making process. So you have to think, I would submit, you have to think beyond data, and maybe it's really what the correlation of data can bring, and that business process, business reengineering value is the heart of that. So is it data, or is it the application of data? So is it maybe titled right, maybe it's titled wrong, but that's certainly what we need to look at.
Well, I'm excited for the rise of the CDO, and I'm giving you a preview of my plans for next year. Bijinder, from a CDO perspective, you started the conversation, I think, a little bit, talking about, it's not so much, again, going back to Greg's point, the data, it's how that data is being used. And Don brought up an interesting point about customer service, and I'm hearing CIOs talk more and more about that customer service. That's where the data is the biggest impact. And I imagine your CDO or whoever you're hiring or you have hired has to have that viewpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, any IT organization has to service customers, internal and external. Obviously, FTC, I mean, being the Consumer Protection Agency, we touch citizens, quite frankly. And I mentioned earlier, I said information architecture. This is really what we need to do. One of the key for us is to look at structured and unstructured data and develop a sound taxonomy. Managing the volume of data obviously is not an issue because technology is becoming cost effective from a cloud perspective. but the context of the data and rationalization of data is extremely important. So that's one of the key challenges for us that we will be working at. But I do want to go back to earlier point that Don made about the workforce impact. And I think, a lot of us in the IT industry, I think in the IT community, sort of get wrapped up in technology issues. I think that some of the biggest challenges in the federal government is the adoption of cloud and big data from a workforce perspective. And I'm going to use one example, and this was several years back, but I think that highlights the success of managing the workforce that translates into using the right technology. HUD, quite frankly, several years back, I mean, they outsourced their infrastructure. Yeah, that can be considered, maybe a cloud implementation. But one of the challenges that HUD took on was really how to transform the workforce, going from hugging the servers to managing services. And it was interesting to see that by implementing very strong performance-based, business-centric SLAs, that they were able to transform their workforce from hugging the servers to providing really the IVNV function, independent validation and verification, and measuring the performance of the IT service provider, the infrastructure service providers, and they made it work. I think it's an example of the kinds of things that we CIOs and the IT community need to really contemplate as we begin to leverage infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and I'm going to also another term, data as infrastructure, quite frankly, as we move to big data. So the impact of all that has a direct implication to the workforce and how we manage that.
It's interesting because there's this move inside government back to that technical side. You talk about how HUD is an example, and we don't want to pick on them per se, but I think a lot of agencies did this. They went from having the technical skills inside to outsourcing it to the private sector, and for good reason. But then they focus on IVMV and project management, and now there's this move back between 18F and the digital services at OMB and even the HHS Buyers Club to bring some of that technical skills back. So I think that's an interesting context. Let me turn to Derek from Microsoft real quick. One thing about the complexities of data analytics and cloud and the convergence is the cost. We've heard on this panel several times that the cost is required to be less than when you do it yourself. But what about the long-term cost, the storage costs of data, the storage costs of the tools that continually get upgraded and get better? Is that a concern that from your customers that you're seeing?
It's kind of interesting because I would say probably a year, maybe 18 months ago, if I went across our federal business and went looking for serious analytics projects, there weren't a lot of them, quite honestly. A lot of shelfware. A lot of customers who deployed big, expensive BI solutions on-premise and weren't doing a whole heck of a lot with them. Again, getting back to the complexity, the workforce issue, and just the fact that, we have all these data silos that we can't really break down on-premise because we've architected systems and architected our data in certain ways. The cloud provides an opportunity, I think, to innovate your way out of that box, if you will, quite honestly. And with that, we bring down the cost of a lot of those tools that traditionally are so difficult to install, maintain, and run on premise. I mean, Don brought up, kind of an interesting transformative notion with regard to people and having them go from being server huggers to folks with analytical skills. I mean, we're doing things now. We're seeing things like predictive analytics capabilities being exposed via a cloud service. That's unheard of 2 years ago. That was something that you spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on licensing. Now you can consume those kind of services on demand from the cloud. So I think it's the goal of companies like ours and some of our other industry competitors to really, again, bring down those costs, lower the barriers of entry, and not necessarily force the hands of federal agencies to go out and find new people to do these things. Make these tasks more approachable from the very get-go with tools, frankly, that are familiar to them today. I mean, the biggest BI tool in the world, just do a little Microsoft self-promotion for a second, is Excel. And at the end of the day, that's where a lot of our efforts have been focused, is in we got Excel across pretty much every desktop in the federal government. Why not provide those capabilities there rather than introduce new tools that introduce training issues and that type of thing.
Don, you wanted to jump in?
I do. So I just want to touch on something that you said that I found, last year and maybe even the year before I was sort of grappling with as we looked at cloud and analytical type tools and cloud services. You stated, and we all sort of shook, there's this understanding or thought that the solutions must be less. They must cost less. I think sort of the approach I take now is, look, yes, cost is a factor, but it's one of many. And at the end of the day, it may not cost us less, right? We have to look at what we're trying to solve here. We have to take a multi-prong sort of look at this. In the OCIO, we have 9 guiding principles, if you will. 2 of them talk about things that I sort of am getting at here. One is that we're going to make smart investment decisions, and every investment will go through an investment process. And the second one talks about we're going to prioritize the needs of the department, and we're going to use that and bring that to bear on the investment decision. But we also, taking cost as a perspective or a component, we have to look at architecture. We have to look at what we're trying to solve. We have to look at the people perspective. We have to look at the technology standards that are accompanied by those, and then make the right business decision. And that might not always cost less.
And I think that's a key point. The cost is important, but if you're getting more value in the end, then you have to. Then the investment makes sense. We only got about 30 seconds left, so let me turn to Greg real quick. Army ITA
Value officer. How about that?
Chief Value Officer.
Right? Because that's what it's all about, is providing value to those that demand the service.
He's been thinking of that this whole time, hasn't he? CVO. Bajinder, you get the last word. The future. Where's FTC? Where you see this all heading?
I think there's a heavy convergence of cloud and data analytics and big data, quite frankly. And I agree. This is not about cost. It's really about business agility, and I think these technologies that we have talked about, they deliver agility to the business, and how we use it, I think that's the key.
All right, very nice. I'm sure we could talk longer, but that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank our guests, Don Adcock, the Acting Chief Information Officer of the Energy Department, Greg Garcia, the Executive Director for the Army Information Technology Agency, Bajinder Paul, the Chief Information Officer for the Federal Trade Commission, and Derek Strasbaugh, the Senior Solutions Specialist at Microsoft Federal. I'm your host, Jason Miller. If you'd like to view this panel online, visit federalnewsradio.com/onecloud.
On behalf of Microsoft, thank you for joining our discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you for you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.